Get started. I'd like to remind everybody that this is live streamed, and be careful, be mindful of your mics. Thanks for the delicious lunch from the Celtic Fox from Federico Durst. We really appreciate it. We'll start with the first audit is groundwater management. Heidi from LPA.
Good afternoon. All right, so this is the Groundwater Management District Audit. The team members for this audit were Cade Graber, Sarah Middendorf, and Holly Alker. Matt Etzel was the audit manager. So this is a 3-question audit, and those questions are on page 2, although for reporting and for presentation purposes, we'll condense this into just 2 questions. I'm going to start with a little bit of background, which starts on page 4. So Kansas regulations define groundwater as water located under the surface of the land and held in an aquifer or supplies wells or springs. In Kansas, we use groundwater for a number of things, including things like irrigation, drinking water, and water for livestock. In Kansas, 3 state agencies have primary responsibility for managing groundwater. The Department of Agriculture is the primary agency for regulating water quantity in Kansas. The Department of Health and Environment is the primary agency for regulating water quality in Kansas. And then the Kansas Water Office is the water planning and policy agency for the state. There are also 2 local government agencies, the conservation districts, and they're responsible for the conservation of water, soil, and other natural resources. And then there's the groundwater management districts, and they oversee certain aspects of the groundwater resources within their district. So even though there are a lot of agencies involved here, the focus of this audit is just the groundwater management districts. So in 1972, the legislature established the process by which local voters can form a groundwater management district. The Groundwater Management District Act allows local voters to create a district for several specific reasons. Those reasons are listed kind of in the middle of page 5. Some of those reasons are for the proper management and conservation of groundwater resources, to prevent economic deterioration, and to stabilize agriculture. So from 1972 to 1976, local voters established 5 districts. And the figure on page 6 shows where each district is located. And as you can see in the figure, the districts cover a portion of land in central and western Kansas. Districts are governed by a board, and that board hires a district manager who oversees the day-to-day operations of the district. Additionally, districts are primarily funded through land and water use assessments. Although districts may occasionally receive state funds related to specific projects or activities, they do not receive an annual state appropriation. So in terms of the authority that districts have, groundwater management districts provide input, but they have little independent authority over many important policies and actions in the state. So for example, districts provide limited input into the Kansas Water Plan. The Kansas Water Plan is the main tool the state uses to address current water issues and to plan for future needs. The districts do provide some input into the water plan, but they have little formal authority in developing that plan. Districts also have a limited role in the water permit approval process. Issuing water permits is ultimately up to the Department of Agriculture. Department officials told us, though, that districts do often review and provide advice on water permits, but it is the department that makes the final decision on issuing a water permit. Districts can also request certain conservation efforts, but again, it's the Department of Agriculture that approves or denies those plans. Districts can request to the chief engineer that local enhanced management areas, or LEMAs, or intensive groundwater use control areas, also called IGUCAs, can be established. Both of those plans restrict water use in the area, but in both of those plans, the chief engineer reviews it and approves or denies it. We also reviewed state statute to determine what districts can do and what they must do. So the statute lays out a number of number of activities that districts can do. So some of those activities include they can acquire land, they conduct research, they can install meters, they can recommend rules and regulations to the state's chief engineer. They can also recommend regulations that apply just to their own specific district. However, state law only requires groundwater districts to do just a few things. So first, each district must have a management program that is approved by the Department of Agriculture. And a management program is a written document that describes the district. It outlines any areas of concern, and it defines the programs the district plans to operate to address those concerns. Additionally, the district's board must review the management program annually. The district must hold an annual meeting to elect board members, report on the activities of the district, and adopt a budget. And then last, if the district levies a charge on local water users, they must submit a budget for public hearing as well as do a few other things. So we reviewed the groundwater management programs for all 5 districts to determine if they complied with state statute. All 5 districts had a management program approved by the Department of Agriculture as required by state law. However, not all the districts reviewed that management program annually as the law requires. So for 2 districts, which was District 1 and 5, we did not find any evidence that the board reviewed the management program in 2020 or in 2021. We also looked at how often districts revise their management program. Now, state law does not require management programs to be revised on any specific timetable. But we did look over the last 30 years to see how often they were revised, and we found that over the last 30 years, most districts have revised their management programs very infrequently. So the figure on page 9 shows when each district revised their management program in the last 30 years. So as an example, you can see that District 2 has not revised their program since 1995, although the district did tell us they are currently revising their program. Additionally, we noted that districts do not have adequate formal written policies that direct when or how they revise their management programs. We also reviewed those district programs and talked with district managers to determine what programs each district operates. Districts currently operate a wide variety of programs, and the figure on page 10 shows the programs the districts currently operate. And as you can see in that figure, most districts offer programs related to things like data collection, research, and public education. Districts do have a great deal of discretion, though, in determining which programs they're going to operate, so long as they do not conflict with state law. The programs that districts operate appear reasonable for the purposes of a groundwater management district. The statutory purpose of the districts are broad and mostly relate to managing groundwater in order to support ag and the economy. And so the district programs do largely support those statutory purposes through things like monitoring groundwater, conducting research, and public education. We also talked with district managers and again reviewed those management programs to understand each district's primary concerns related to groundwater management. So we compared the programs that districts operated to their areas of concern to determine whether they had programs that address those concerns. So as you can see in the figure on page 11, each district identified multiple areas of concern. Issues related to the depletion of groundwater were mentioned by all 5 districts. Further, all 5 districts operated at least one program in 2021 that addressed each of their concerns. On page 12, we're going to change gears just a little bit. We're going to talk about expenditures and program effectiveness. So we collected expenditure data by various categories and programs for each district for calendar year 2021. In 2021, the districts spent a total of $6.1 million. Overall, the largest share of district expenditures was for salaries and benefits. The figure on page 13 shows those expenditures broken down by category. As you can see, 41% of district expenditures were for salaries and benefits. 21% were for professional services, and that includes things like accountants, lawyers, consultants. 14% of district expenditures were for administrative costs. That included things like rent, utilities, office supplies. And then about 24% were for other expenses, and those largely included expenses associated with grants and with nonprofit foundations. We also looked at expenditures by area of concern. And districts do not maintain their expenditure data in a way that allowed us to easily assess that. So we had to estimate how much each district spent on their areas of concern. We estimated that the majority of each district's expenditures were for programs that addressed an area of concern. So figure 6, which is on page 14, shows that percentage for each district. We also noted that districts have significant discretion in how they spend their funds, and statute does not require them to fund any specific program or activity. And last, we're going to talk about program effectiveness. So we reviewed water level data to understand current conditions within each district. We used data provided by the Kansas Geological Survey. And we compared groundwater measurements taken in 2012 to measurements taken in 2022. And that data showed that 3 of the 5 districts had overall declines in groundwater levels over the last 10 years. However, districts 2 and 5, both in central Kansas, have had slight increases. The figure 8, which is on page 17, shows how water levels have changed over the last 10 years in each district. We also look to determine the effectiveness of district programs intended to address water quantity issues. However, due to time, data, and expertise limitations, we were unable to determine whether district programs effectively address those concerns. However, we did review studies by the Department of Agriculture and by K-State on the effectiveness of certain conservation measures. So the Department of Agriculture reviewed in Iguca, located in District 2. In 2016, the department found that the rate of water level decline had slowed since it was implemented. Another study conducted by K-State in 2017 of an Iguca in District 5 found that it resulted in statistically significant reductions in water use. Further, in 2018, K-State also released the results of a 5-year study of one of the LEMAs in District 4. And that study found that the LEMA resulted in a 16% reduction in average groundwater use per acre. Last, the districts do not consistently monitor the effectiveness of their programs. However, monitoring the effectiveness of some programs, such as conservation efforts, often involve long-term study or significant data analysis. And in these cases, the districts do not appear to have the expertise and resources necessary to consistently determine whether those types of programs are effective. We did make 2 recommendations in this audit. Those are on page 20. The first recommendation was to the legislature to consider requiring districts to update their management programs on a set timetable. And the second was to the districts to develop written policies that describe when and how they will revise their management programs. All 5 districts did respond. All 5 districts told us that they do intend to implement that recommendation. That concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Heidi. Are there any questions for Heidi? Senator Ware.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. In getting the concerns for the different districts and or any of the other issues, my district is in Wichita. That's my primary focus, of course. Did you talk to Wichita? I know that there's a lot going on around water in Wichita, which is decidedly different, of course, from what it would be in western Kansas.
We are aware of the ASR project in Wichita, and that has brought a lot of work and a number of issues. We didn't talk to Wichita specifically. We did talk to the district about kind of what they were doing in that project, but we didn't speak to Wichita.
Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the presentation. Water's complicated. I know Representative Highland did a lot of research on it with 16 layers of oversight. Yeah, you know where I'm going. Did you have an opportunity to look at duplication of efforts or efficiencies, how they could be managed or exposed? I know you were limited on your resources. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That specific question was a little out of the kind of the scope of this particular audit, but we did see the overlap, as I kind of mentioned very early, you know, in kind of the background information. There are a lot of different agencies involved here. Some of them are state agencies, some are local. There's even, in some cases, there's some federal involvement. So there are a lot of different people involved in groundwater management. We did see conservation efforts that were conducted by a variety of different groups as well. So we do see the overlap, but assessing that overlap just wasn't in the scope of the audit.
Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Quick question. Do we know, you talked about monitoring the effectiveness of what they're doing. Do we know what kind of a period of database they're working with regard to the water depletion?
I believe most of the districts are working with the Kansas Geological Survey, which has extensive information and data on groundwater depletion. They have a number of wells all over the state that they are monitoring annually. And so they do have, in conjunction with the Kansas Geological Survey, there is a fair amount of data out there, and they are accessing that data.
Okay, so they should be able to use that to determine whether or not, I'm guessing you talked about there's some ambiguity about the effectiveness, but I would think that with regard to water depletion, that should be something they could monitor probably more effectively, I'm guessing.
That data is very effective for kind of monitoring and knowing we're up, we're down, what's happening. But using that data to determine is any one program effective starts to become much more complicated. Okay. They're operating a lot of programs to address the same issue. You have other agencies also doing various things. And so being able to use that data to isolate the effect of one program to say that program is or is not effective does get complex.
That makes it tough. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, so we're running up on time here. We've got 3 more questions in the queue. Rep. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this will be brief. So it says that the water districts are primarily funded from land and water use assessments, but we see on page 10 that there is one district that doesn't do any water metering. All the others do, but yet they do have concerns with depletion of groundwater and increased need for water. So my question really is tying all those together, how the water metering and the payment by assessments versus the depletion may or may not relate.
They are funded primarily through land and water assessments. Now, exactly how the details of that assessment works, probably someone from the district can provide that information. But that is the source of their data. Whether how that ties to water metering for the purposes they're using it for, again, I'm not sure, but I think the districts could provide a much more educated answer to that than I could.
Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I know in the 80s they issued a lot of more new water rights, but what are other states doing to contribute to, trying to curb our usage or trying to build our storage back? Because it looks like to me, the farther you get away from the state line, the better off we are. And the closer we get to the state line, it seems like, are they doing anything? They doing their part, or do we know?
We didn't assess what the other states were doing in terms of whether or not they were doing enough, or how it reflected kind of what was happening in Kansas. But we did talk to some other states. Page 19 has a little bit of that information. So we talked to Colorado, Idaho, Nebraska, and Texas. Obviously, just Colorado and Nebraska are our neighbors. But we talked to them in terms of whether or not they had something similar to groundwater management districts. Were they doing something similar to what we were doing with those organizations? And the answer was yes. All of those states have a very similar organization, many of them are called groundwater districts in those other states. They're structured a lot like ours. They have many of the same responsibilities, the same authorities, and they're even operating many of the same programs. So from that perspective, the districts we talk to we're doing very similar things to them.
Senator Corson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we've got in here that the districts have concerns. Do they have long-term plans to address those concerns? And then can you talk about it specifically in the context of depletion of the aquifer? I mean, we know that that's rapidly depleting. What are their plans around that to address that in a comprehensive way? Because I think that's a significant challenge for the state. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The district's management programs should be the primary tool they use to lay out the concerns in their districts, whether that's depletion, and all of them do have depletion concerns, and other things as well, and to lay out the programs they intend to operate to address those things. So that is kind of the main tool they should use. We did note that all districts had those plans. They do have to be approved by the Department of Agriculture. That is happening. Our concern there is that they're not revised very often. District 4 did a great job of revising. They revise very frequently, but most of the other districts don't. As I noted, one district hasn't revised it since 1995. And so potentially when you have that length of time, when that program, that main tool isn't being updated, you do have some risks that document just no longer reflects the conditions of the district. And so we do see that is potentially a problem.
What about what about addressing the aquifer depletion specifically? What are plans around that? What are they doing to try to get their arms around that?
Districts are tackling that issue through a variety of ways. So some districts have implemented LEMAs or the IGUCAs, and those, like I said, those are areas within the district that have very stringent conservation measures. And there's a variety of measures they can take. But some districts have chosen to address the depletion issue by saying, we're going to use less water. We're going to find ways to reduce our consumption of that water. Other districts have chosen some other ways. They've looked at irrigation, using better irrigation technology so that they use less water through that. Some of them have launched public education programs, tried to get their irrigators and their water users to just do a better job and to understand those conservation principles. And so they all have concerns about depletion. They all told us they were concerned about it. They all had programs to address that depletion, but they are all tackling it in different ways.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks. There are Department of Ag officials in the room, along with some of the district people, and our House Chair of Water is in the room too. If you have any questions for them afterwards, you can take them up. We'll move on to thank you very much. We'll move on to the next audit, and we'll have Andy present Election Security Part 1.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee, so this is, as he just mentioned, part 1 of what is now a 2-part audit. It was initially approved as one 5-question audit. It is now 2 parts, and this one is going to address what were originally questions 3, 4, and 5 in the proposal, and you can see those on page 2. The first one is whether county election officers receive adequate training to administer federal elections in their counties. The second one is how Kansas's practices for maintaining, using, and sharing ballot images and cast vote records compared to other states. And the third one is what policies and practices do the Secretary of State and county election officers have to protect the integrity of voting for long-term care facility residents. So if you flip with me to page 4, we will get into question 1, the answer to which you can see at the top of the page. So we found that county election officers told us that they felt prepared to oversee elections, but we couldn't verify their training or the training of the workers that work for them in the counties because this generally is not being tracked. And we'll get to that in a moment, but let's start with some background and kind of set the stage with the rest of page 4, top of page 5. So in figure 1 on page 4, you can see that elections are very complex processes that require a lot of people and a lot of different procedures to happen within specific timeframes, which adds to their complexity. So in our estimation, successfully running and overseeing such a complex process requires preparation in the form of training. And this would be for 2 different groups, and I very briefly mentioned them before. But the first one is county election officers, and the second is county election workers, and I will take them in turn. And this is on the middle and bottom of page 5. So all 105 counties have a county election officer. This is the person who is responsible for overseeing all aspects of elections in their county. In 101 counties, it's the elected county clerk. In the 4 most populous counties, it is an appointed election commissioner. And these people are doing things like maintaining the voter registration rolls, accepting candidate filings, finding polling places and getting those secured, and appointing election workers. There's a little bit more information about them at the bottom of page 5. So election workers are really the people who are doing the frontline work to have an election. So your average voter, when they go to a polling place, the people that they're interacting with are the election workers. They're checking them in, giving them ballots, helping them out. And those are the people who the officers appoint to help them run the elections. So if we flip to page 6, you'll see that we reviewed state law to see what the training requirements were for these 2 groups, county election officers and workers. So state law, as you can see towards the top of page 6, only requires that county election officers receive training relating to their duties. There are no other requirements in state law. So state law does not say what this training should cover, how much they should get, how often they should receive it, anything like that. State law leaves it to the discretion of the Secretary of State's office to decide what the content and delivery of this training should look like. You can see this outlined towards the top, the top half, I guess, of page 6. That what they do essentially is take over one of the training sessions of the Kansas County Clerks and Election Officials Association's conference every year, and they give county election officers this required training. As you can see towards the top of page 7, we weren't able to assess whether this training is sufficient to adequately prepare county election officers to do their duties and oversee elections in their counties for 2 reasons. The first is that state law is so sparse on this that we couldn't define or measure adequacy. The second is that no one is tracking whether county election officers attend this training. So neither the Secretary of State's office nor the KCCEOA is tracking in a formalized way who is attending the training. If we flip back to page 6, the bottom half addresses the workers. And you can see here, again, state law is similarly sparse. So state law only requires that county election officers provide their workers with training before each election. It doesn't say anything about what the training should cover or how much of it workers should get. It's left to the counties to decide how to do that on their own. And as you can see on the bottom of page 6 and spilling onto the top of page 7, this looks very different across the counties that we reviewed. And there's details about that there. Moving down to the bottom of page 7, you'll see that we reviewed 8 counties to see whether they were indeed training their workers. So we looked at their records from the 2022 general election to get a sense of whether they were training all of their workers immediately before that election as required. At the bottom of page 7, you can see that we found that Harvey, Riley, and Wyandotte counties all appeared to have trained all of their workers before that election. Flipping to page 8, you'll see that Douglas and Johnson counties gave us documentation showing that they did not train all of their workers before that election. So you can see that Douglas County, they had 50 workers who were not trained before the 2022 general election. Most of them were trained before the primary election, so 3 months before that, so we think the impact is probably minimal. Most of the Johnson County workers who were not trained right before the general election were also trained right before the primary. So again, probably a minimal effect. In Douglas County, 21 were trained in previous years. So they'd worked some previous election in a previous year. They were trained. So they had some experience and some training. It was just older. Same was true for 5 of the Johnson County workers. But then we had 2 Douglas County workers with no training records and 2 Johnson County workers who were never trained. So I want to stress that these are really, really small numbers. So we're talking about, in Johnson County's case, 1,500 workers, and 2 of them didn't have training. So these are small numbers overall. Finally, we had 3 counties, as you can see in the middle of page 8, that either didn't provide us with documentation, or they gave us documentation that we couldn't independently confirm. So this was Chase, Ford, and Jackson counties. The county election officers said that they trained all of their workers. We had hoped to see some documentation that showed this, but these are smaller counties, so it's entirely possible that they could track whether their workers are being trained without a formalized process of the kind that Douglas and Johnson use. Okay, bottom of page 8, all of page 9, all of page 10, you'll see that we also administered a survey for county election officers to get a sense of whether they felt prepared to administer elections in their counties. Overall, they did report feeling very prepared. So let's look at figure 2, top of page 9. This is a great example. So you'll see that 96% of respondents said that overall they felt either extremely or very prepared to administer and oversee federal elections in their counties. Flipping to page 10, figure 3, you'll see that we also asked them some questions about that annual training that the Secretary of State's office administers that I've mentioned a couple of times. And overall, they had positive opinions about that too. First line of figure 3, you'll see that 97% said that that training covered topics that were extremely or very relevant to their role administering and overseeing the elections in their counties. Bottom of page 10, you'll see that they provided us with some specific feedback about different types of training or different types of assistance that they would like to receive from the Secretary of State's office. I will leave it to you to review those details if you're interested. Flipping to page 11, you'll see that we also compared Kansas's very sparse training requirements to 5 other states. So this was Colorado, Florida, Maryland, Missouri, and Utah to see how Kansas compared. As you can see at the top of page 11, with regard to those county election officers who are administering and overseeing their county elections, 3 of those 5 states had more robust training requirements. So I'll use Colorado as an example. It's the first sub-bullet towards the top of page 11. So in Colorado, they required county election officers to complete a certification program that was administered by the Secretary of State's office. It had a specific format, curriculum, number of hours, and frequency. It had continuing professional education requirements. It was a pretty robust program. Conversely, as you can see towards the sort of in the middle there, neither Missouri nor Utah had any training requirements. So that's obviously very different from Colorado, and it's also different from even Kansas's minimal training requirements. At the bottom of page 11 and the top half of page 12, you'll see that we also looked at these states' requirements for election workers. And again, 3 of 5 states had greater state involvement in the election worker training, and they had developed more detailed requirements related to this. So in this case, at the bottom of page 11, I'll use Maryland as an example. So Maryland's State Board of Elections created a training program that all county election officers are required to use. So here we can see the state is exercising a greater role in determining what workers should be getting. Conversely, if you flip to page 12, you'll see that Utah, again, didn't have any training requirements for county election workers. So that's the answer to question 1. I'm going to go now to question 2, which, as a reminder, was how do Kansas's practices for maintaining, using, and sharing ballot images and cast vote records compare to other states' practices? So in the middle of page 12, you'll see in the big bold our answer to that question, which is that Kansas maintains and uses ballot images and cast vote records similarly to most of these states, but is more restrictive than some about sharing them. So actually, I'm going to have you all jump forward to page 14 to figure 4, because I think it's helpful to see what these things are, and so I will talk you through figure 4. So figure 4 shows both a ballot image on the right and a cast vote record on the left. So as you can see here, when a ballot is read by an optical scanner, so the voter fills out their ballot and then they run it through an optical scanner to tally it, the optical scanner can take a photo of the ballot image, capture a digital image. And as you can see on the right of figure 4, it is literally just an image of the ballot. It shows exactly what it looks like. Okay, the scanner can also, if it has the capability, create a cast vote record. So this is the text file that's on the left here. And this is simply showing how the scanner read the ballot. So in this instance, as you can see, the scanner was capable of understanding what the voter's intent was. For a comptroller, attorney general, and US senator, you can see that because there's one line that's green, and that's how the scanner read the voter's intent. For governor, you'll see that the scanner had trouble interpreting the voter's intent. That's why there's 2 lines that are red. And this is the cast vote record for this ballot image. And if you look at the governor race, you'll see that this voter very badly filled out 2 of the selections, actually, for governor. So the scanner couldn't interpret which one it was supposed to be counting. Now, this is actually a great example of one of the main reasons why we heard that counties use this functionality. So there are cases where the scanner can't on its own understand what the voter intends. And when that's the case, the county election officials can use the ballot image to review exactly what the voter did and try to suss that out on their own. The other primary reason why we heard county election officials are using these digital copies of ballots is for the post-election auditing process. So in a county with tens or hundreds of thousands of ballots, it is more efficient to query their database of ballot images, pull up the ones from the precincts that they're auditing, rather than manually look through all of them. Okay, so at the top of page 15, you'll see that nothing requires in Kansas counties to use these things. So some of the counties we talked to, 2 of them had scanners that couldn't create ballot images. It was an optional extra that they would have had to pay their vendor more for, and they didn't think they needed it, so they didn't have that functionality. 4 of the 6 counties that we reviewed had scanners that couldn't create cast vote records. Similarly, they just didn't see that as useful to them, and so they didn't have that. Now, at the bottom of page 15 and the top of, actually all of page 16, you'll see that we again compared what's going on in Kansas through a selection of counties to what's going on in those 5 states I mentioned before. So it's Colorado, Florida, Maryland, Missouri, Utah. And sort of the main takeaway of this is that in Kansas, there is not good, clear statewide guidance for counties in terms of what they should be doing with these digital copies of ballots, especially with regard to how long they should maintain them and whether they should share them. So on pages 15 and 16, you'll see that the other states we reviewed had stronger statewide guidance in this area. So all 5 states retained ballot images and cast vote records for the same 22 months that they kept paper ballots, which is the federal requirement for paper ballots. In Kansas, there is no guidance for this in state law. Ballot images and cast vote records are not specifically mentioned, and so we saw various things, and it was mostly just based on what was practical for the county. So for instance, some counties told us that they just kept them as long as they had hard drive space to do so, which could be more or less than 22 months, but it's really just kind of a crapshoot. With regard to using them, we saw that the counties that do use them for those 2 purposes that I mentioned before. So this is adjudicating ballots that the scanner couldn't understand, and the post-election auditing process that they're required to do. That's what the other states that use them for as well. And then with regard to whether they share them, despite the fact that there isn't good statewide guidance on this, the counties that we talked to were erring on the side of caution, keeping these things secret and not sharing them even when requested. In the other states that we looked at, there's greater guidance on this. So even when they are kept secret, statute makes that clear. In a couple of states, Colorado and Maryland and Florida, they are made public, and that's clear in statute. And so you can either query them on an online database, which is actually where we got figure 4, or you can request them through an open records request. Okay, so let's go to page 17 and talk about sort of pros and cons of making these things public in the way that Colorado, Maryland, and Florida have done. So the pros that we heard related to this, as you can see on page 17, are really related to transparency, increasing public trust in the election process, things like that. The cons were related to the expectation among voters that their ballot is secret, which is something that the Secretary of State's office said they get questions about from voters. Also, there are technological barriers that would have to be overcome. This is something that Colorado described to us, the technology that's required to, for instance, create an online database would be pretty significant. It would require a pretty significant investment, not only because not all counties have scanners that can create these things, but also standing up a database like that would be a technological challenge. And then one election official told us that they had some security concerns related to people's ability to grab ballot images from that online database, doctor them, and then distribute them. So that is our answer to question 2. Question 3, flipping to page 18, just as a reminder, is what policies and practices do the Secretary of State and county election officers have to protect the integrity of voting for long-term care facility residents? You'll see at the top of page 18 that facility officials and county election officials described having a few very basic practices related to this, but it really wasn't very much, and I'll get into that in a moment. So just to be clear, at the top of page 18, when we say long-term care facilities, we're talking about places like nursing homes or assisted living facilities. And they provide varying levels of care to their residents, but these are people who are living in these facilities full-time. As you'll see at the bottom of page 18 and the top of page 19, the national literature on this is pretty sparse. A lot of it was dated. Kind of the broad strokes are that there are 2 areas of concern for people. So one is that improving residents' voting access, so in other words, making it easier for them to vote, and maybe with the assistance of someone who they trust, is a way to, in the national literature, help prevent fraud and undue influence. The other is ensuring that they have access to all the information that they need to make an informed decision. At the bottom of page 19, you'll see that we reviewed state law, and there are very few requirements that are related to this. Some of them overlap with some of the things that we saw in the national literature, but none of them were specifically for long-term care. And I'll give you an example. So state law says that officials must let voters choose who helps them. If they're at a polling place, state law also requires that the county provide them with a bipartisan team to help them. At the bottom of page 19 and the top of page 20, you'll see that there was some optional practices that were related to this too. A great example of this would be that counties can set up mobile polling places actually in the facilities, specifically for the residents to help improve their access to voting. At the bottom of page 20 and then the top of page 21, you'll see that we reviewed 7 facilities practices. We just sort of talked to them about what they do in this space. And we also talked to county election officials from Ford, Lincoln, and Wyandotte counties. By and large, what they're doing is relying on their normal processes. So a great example of this would be mail-in ballots. A lot of the residents of facilities like this are permanent mail-in voters, mail voters. And so in the facilities that they live at, they just use the normal mail process. They use the same common mailbox. By and large, there's a couple that will hand deliver the completed ballots back to the county election office. That was rare. County election officials we talked to also generally said that they just meet those standard requirements in state law, and they're not doing some of that extra stuff like setting up a mobile polling place specifically for the residents in the facility. Okay, that's the meat of the audit. I am obliged to direct your attention to the recommendation section. So at the bottom of page 21, you will see that the Secretary of State's office rejected our recommendation to them. So we thought that they should more proactively hold county election officers accountable for receiving that annual training that they administer that I mentioned before. We thought this could include requiring and tracking attendance at this training session, which they're not currently doing. And as you can see on pages 21, all of page 22, top of page 23, they provided us with their rationale for rejecting that. At the top of page 23, you'll see we also had a couple of recommendations for legislative consideration. These are related to strengthening those training requirements for county election officers and workers, which, as I mentioned, were pretty sparse, and clarifying how ballot images and cast vote records should be treated by the counties, particularly with regard to maintaining them, how long, whether they can share them in instances where they choose to use them. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Committee, any questions for Andy? Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the presentation. I do have a few questions, if I may, Mr. Chairman. First off, how is feeling prepared a measurable quantity? On page 10 of the document, that to me is not an audit. it's how somebody feels, whether they're meeting a standard or not. Why did you decide to go that route?
So we wanted to get a sense of whether county election officers felt prepared to administer the elections that are happening in their county. That was just part of the work. The thrust of the work was really reviewing whether they were getting the training they were supposed to, whether that training was sufficiently robust, in our opinion. But we did want to see how they felt and whether they thought they were prepared.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I would want more quantitative measures, and I would suggest, like, we had primary elections, I can tell you, where they inverted the election results. That's the type of information we're looking for, the facts. So I would ask, my next question is, from the ballot, the actual ballot to the scanned image, did you test or verify results of the scanning machines to go to an electronic?
No, we didn't do that. And the types of controls that you're describing, I think what we're going to do in part two, which is more directly related to whether the counties have adequate policies and procedures in place to ensure the security of their elections. What you're describing, what you're asking about, will be more similar to what will be in part two, but we are not directly testing in either part whether the machines are functioning as they are intended to.
Yeah, and that's a concern. If I may, Mr. Chairman, I would ask, a couple of the clerks that I visited with couldn't understand why their testing did not catch the problem before the election. Well, they were putting in 5 ballots for one candidate and 5 ballots for the other candidate. So when the machine inverts the count, there is no way it's going to catch it. I hope that we look at this audit and go a little bit deeper than just how we feel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Andy?
So I would say that, so the 1-to-1 ratio that you're describing for the logic and accuracy testing, the 15 counties that we're reviewing for part two, we are assessing whether or not they're using a 1-to-1 ratio in that testing because, as you say, if the votes were inverted, it wouldn't be caught. It has to be a different ratio. So we are cognizant of that, and that will be in part two.
Senator Olson?
Just my comment. I think this audit partly shows that there's really not good controls around the process and making sure that the process is run uniformly. To me, we need to go back and do some serious work and at the legislature and create that process because I just, we got drop boxes over there that are in place and they're not in statute. People are just doing stuff and we need to, look at this seriously, both parties, and put a set of rules in, we follow them. It's no different than obeying the speed limit or anything else. But, when you look at this, we don't even know if people are taking the training. We don't know what level of training. These are some of the rules that need to be put in place. And I think, it's our job on both parties and all people, make them feel like they got a fair election. And without a process, I don't see that.
Senator Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Andy. Quick question on the training. Did it include electronic security training, IT training at all with regard to the election process and how to detect any issues? I'm just kind of curious about that.
Which training, the officers or the workers?
I guess you would probably definitely want the officers to be trained in that type of stuff so they could identify any problems. I didn't know if that was part of their training.
So we looked at a couple of years of training materials for the officers, and it's the training that is administered by the Secretary of State's office at that annual conference. What we saw is that primarily they cover updates, so things like legislative updates due to statutory changes. In 2022, they covered our audit, actually, that we're talking about right now. But I didn't see anything in those materials in those years that would be like what you're describing.
And I'm guessing that with regard to that training, for a quantitative measure, it might be good to suggest to the Secretary of State they administer tests and grade those election officers to see, if they absorb the material correctly. That's just a thought. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And perhaps it's just my experience, but every single time I have been an election worker, my experience is quite different from most of what you've described. I felt trained in excruciating detail with every single step, every aspect, and perhaps Sedgwick County is different.
Senator Corson.
I just want to point out that I think one of the challenges is that we have 105 counties, we have 105 separate independent election officers, and I think it is really hard for a Secretary of State to tell a duly elected county election officer, do we want to, so they're elected, right? So to kind of what Senator Thompson said, so they don't complete this training. Well, what do? They were elected by the voters in that county. They're an elected official. So is the Secretary of State gonna somehow, I guess, impeach or get rid of a county election official who's been elected by their voters who doesn't complete the training? So I'm just pointing out that I think there are some challenges in asking the Secretary of State's office to really take over the training because of our 105 county system and because 101 of these folks are elected officials. So I'm not necessarily disagreeing with this sentiment, but I'm just pointing out the logistical challenge and burden that would be, and it's kind of a separation of powers issue. So thank you.
Yeah, one would argue, though, that the Secretary of State's main function is elections and election security, and so I would think he would have the right to do something at least. Representative Probst.
I just want to jump on that too, because we could do that, but we would have to actively say that we want to take a bigger role at the state level and usurp the authority of local government, which we, on one hand, tend to not want to do unless it's convenient for us, and then we do want to do it. And I too think that we should look at these elections, because every person I ask in my election in my district says they voted for me, and the numbers don't reflect that.
Any Representative Sawyer.
I'll go a little different route. The copies of the paper ballots and the images that are scanned, I was trying to read through this quickly. So it sounds like some states make that public information, like Colorado puts it on a website, if I heard that right.
That's right.
It does seem like if we would make that more transparent, if it's more available to the public, they might feel better about the elections, knowing that after the fact, people could verify that that's why the ballots were cast.
That is one of the potential benefits that we heard about from both county election officers, but also the Secretary of State's office in Colorado. One of the main benefits that they saw was the transparency.
Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick comment on the report. Again, thank you. And it looks like the legislature has some work to do on elections. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It seems like almost every single area, the laws are almost silent, and I think we need to take a hard look at it, especially with our long-term care facilities, because our population is aging and it's going to become a bigger issue if we don't get our arms around it. I'm not seeing any other further questions for Andy. There are, or should be, representatives from the Secretary of State, Harvey and Jackson County in the audience, if anybody has a question for them. Not seeing any. Thank you very much, Andy. Moving on to the consent calendar items, and we'll get an update from Kristen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee. So there are 3 things on today's consent calendar, which you can find in tab A of your notebook. So the first of those is just approval of the minutes from your last meeting, which was January 25th. That is shown within tab A. You'll see 2 attachments. So attachment A is the minutes from the last meeting. Just a reminder, if anyone wasn't, I think you all were present, so that doesn't matter, I guess. The second item on the consent calendar is acceptance of the performance audits that were presented today. So that would include both the groundwater management district audit and the election security audit. And then there is a third item on today's consent calendar, which is approval of a limited scope audit. So that, again, within tab A, you'll see a second attachment, attachment B. That is a 100-hour audit that would have us looking at the Kansas African American Affairs Commission. And the question is, did they comply with key legal requirements and make appropriate expenditures this last year? So unless there's objection from the committee, those items will be considered approved by the committee without objection. Members may abstain from voting on minutes if they weren't present.
Any questions for Kristen? Senator Corsick.
I don't have a question. I just want to make an objection when the time's appropriate.
Any other questions? Seeing none. Motion to object.
So I would make the motion to object and to remove the limited scope audit request from the list of approved audits and to treat it as a regular performance audit. And here's the reason why. We've sort of, both years that I've been on the committee, we always have this challenge of we accept a lot of these limited scope audits, and then we get to the meeting at the end of session where we're supposed to consider these audits, and we find that we basically kind of filled our queue of potential audits, and we have very few audits that we can accept. So I think that we should wait until our meeting in a couple months and look at all of the different audit, when we can look at this proposed audit in context of all of the different proposed audits that we have and decide if we want to prioritize it. Because 100 hours on this is 100 hours less that we're going to have to allot to a different audit potentially in, I think it's April that we meet and usually decide those. So I would rather just put this in the queue, put it back in the regular process. That's my reason for the objection. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Traditionally, the chair does the initial approval of the audits and then brings it to us. And so my question is, how many of the limited scope do we have? I'm kind of looking at it right here. I'm not sure.
Kristen.
It's the only one that's currently on the list as a limited scope.
So it's the only one that our chairperson has approved to date. And I know the representative that brought this forward has done his own due diligence and research and has requested this. So I have to support, I mean, obviously it can be pulled from the consent, but I do support this as a limited scope.
Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, there's no reason why I think it's good to go ahead and do the limited scope, and we can always bring it back if there's further needs to be done on it and put it in the queue later on this. So I think this is a way to kind of get it started, make sure there's enough there to have a full-blown audit. That's not unusual. We do that a lot. We're going to only have a limited number of audits. It's probably 3 or 4 or 5. And, it seems like the buckets always get filled up. So I wouldn't want to miss this opportunity, at least till let's start this. And, if it really needs a full-blown audit, then we could give it that audit.
Yeah, Senator, so when this first came to me, it looked a lot more like a full-blown audit. We had the gentleman that brought it to our attention scale it down tremendously so that we could take a quick look, a 100-hour audit at it to see if we needed to go further. So I would agree with that. Representative Probst, did you have a? Nope. Are there any other comments? Senator Ware.
Thanks. So, thank you, Mr. Chair. So we're suggesting that we'll do the smaller scope audit and then maybe also do a bigger one and have less time for another one, perhaps? Is that what we're considering?
Senator Corsick. that's what your objection was. We're not going to have time for other audits because of this 100-hour audit. Is that correct?
Yeah, my objection is that we've sort of, I think by doing this out of the normal cycle, I know that you've approved it preliminarily. I think that we should just put it back in the queue, look at it when we have more things to compare and see if we want to prioritize it, or see if there may be other proposals we get that we may think are more worthy of our really talented team's time. I just don't see any urgency behind this. I don't see anything in this that's time sensitive. And so I think we can look at it in the context of other audits. But I think when we start doing these in isolation, then everything looks good, and then we end up filling our queue. And then by the time we get to our meeting where we're supposed to pick out our audits, we kind of feel that the queue is very full already. And so that's the reason for my objection. I would just put this back into the normal process, and we can evaluate it when we have that meeting.
There's nothing abnormal about this. This is the normal process. It's only a 100-hour audit, and it is Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think what we would normally do, there's been objection. Wouldn't we now vote on if we want to just keep that as a?
I think it needs to be a formal motion to remove the limited scope audit from the list of approved audits and treat it as a regular performance audit, and then you all would work that as normal.
So you'd have to make a
So-
motion, someone to have second.
Go ahead and make the motion.
So can I get, so I would move that we let me get the language. I would move that I would make a motion to remove the limited scope audit from the list of approved audits and to treat it as a regular performance audit.
Is there a second clarification?
Thank you,
Senator
Mr.
Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask, does he mean higher than a 100-hour audit then?
Right. So to clarify, I think I misstated my initial motion. What I just want to do is have this on the list when we have our meeting in April, when we make the decision about what audits that we want. So I don't know exactly what form that would be the appropriate language. That's what I'm getting at. I just want to not approve this now. I want this to go back into the queue for consideration when we have other audits and other priorities that we can compare it against.
Still as a limited scope.
Still is a limited scope.
I think really what Mr. Chair, is this right?
Senator Olson.
I think your motion would be to vote either not to do it now, but I don't think you can really vote to put it in, the hopper. I think whoever wrote it would have to go back to Chris, rewrite it for a larger scope, and then put it in the hopper. Your motion would be not to approve it today for a limited scope, I would believe. Is that right? So.
I'm going to defer to Tamara. She has the rules right in front of her.
Tamara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. LPAC Rule 1.3, subsection B2 is the motion that Senator Corson is making, and it states that a member of the committee who has an objection to a limited scope audit that has been preliminarily approved and placed on the committee consent calendar shall state such objection in the form of a motion to remove the limited scope audit from the list of preliminarily approved audits and treat it as a regular performance audit subject to LPAC Rule 1.5.
All right, so you sure that's what you want to do? You want to take, your argument is that we're limited on time and audits. You want to take a 100-hour audit off the consent calendar and consider it for a full audit, which would be more time.
Really what I want to do is what Senator Olson said. I just want to have us not approve it today and then look at it later.
Is that acceptable in the rules? It is. Okay. Is there a second? Senator Ware. And any discussion, Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And on this item that could have been a full-scale audit, many times they can be, and they're they're scaled back so that you can get a timely bit of information. And there is an item in the governor's budget that increases the commission budget allowance, and so therefore, this would be very helpful as we go through the appropriations and Ways and Means process. And the maker, or the representative that requested this is here. I don't know if it's appropriate, Mr. Chairman, if he responds to any of this, but I do support his motion to take a look at it, and it will help us make a better, oh, I'm sorry, I do not support your motion. I support the original intent to have the 100-hour review so that we will have the best information to make budget decisions when that happens.
We'll wait and let the representative speak to it if it gets taken off of the consent calendar when we bring it back for a full-blown audit, because that will be what we do. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of removing this from the consent calendar, say aye. All against, say no. Noes appear to have it. Division, all in favor, raise your right hand. All against, raise your right hand. 5-4, motion fails. Any further discussion on the consent calendar? Any other objections? Seeing none. Consent calendar is accepted. And we need to talk about the next meeting date. Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In tab B, there should be a little memo and then a fold-out graphic showing what's in process and what's in the queue. Next up, I will work with the chair to solidify dates, but it's looking like late March, the child support enforcement audit would be ready if you wanted to have a meeting then. The April meeting that Senator Corson was referring to when you pick topics, it's normally in April. It's normally right before the veto session. So if we stuck with that, it would be roughly April 25th. But again, we'll work out specific dates. And then the next audit coming due would be Election Security Part 2 sometime in May. And as you can see on that fold-out chart, again, I'm just showing what's yet to be done so far. We have 3 audits approved last April that we're getting ready to start soon: the working from home, the community college athletics, and the follow-up audit. So those all need to be kicked off before we meet in that April meeting.
All right, so do we choose a date today, or do we get with them?
If you'd like to choose a date today, if you wanted to have a March meeting, the agenda item at that time that I know of today is the child support enforcement. We would be looking at Wednesday, March 22nd, or up until, sometime that week. But probably if we stick with Wednesday, that would be March 22nd.
So, Senators, I'd ask you if Mondays would work for the Senate. It seems that, like today, we were late. All the House members were late because we don't work on Mondays on the floor, but we do work on Wednesdays, and it might be an issue for all of us to get here. It's been an issue twice already.
I'm good with Mondays. I don't know. It seems like a dead day around here, but we're always meeting, so.
All right, so we'll do a Monday in March after we're back.
Possibly. That'll be tight because we're not slated to be done with it until Monday. So that one's going to be tight. As far as the April meeting, the veto session begins on Wednesday. We typically meet the day before, which would be Tuesday.
Let's plan for that.
Okay, so that is Tuesday, April 25th for sure. And we'll be in contact about the possible March meeting, the 20th or 22nd.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much, everybody. We're adjourned.